Welcome, welcome, welcome. If everybody would sort of take their seats. I want to wish everybody a good afternoon and welcome to the House Committee on Natural Resources Black History Month Forum. He's not here yet, but I want to thank our chairman, Raul Grijalva, for his leadership for convening today's panel. I also want to thank our distinguished panelists for sharing their time. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces. We cannot thank you enough for sharing your expertise with us, and today we look forward to learning from you. Since its creation 50 years ago, Black History Month has been a time to recognize the remarkable achievements of the African American community and to reflect on the work that remains to be done to ensure equity and inclusion. It is noteworthy that Black History Month this year coincides with the Natural Resources Committee's Climate Change Month. It's acutely important, given the urgency of addressing and mitigating the impacts of climate change, that this forum juxtapose the preservation of Black history and culture with the forceful call for environmental justice and climate action. For generations, African American communities have been foundationally important to the environmental and conservation movements. Black leadership has played a pivotal but often untold role in these movements. People like Captain Charles Young, who was born into slavery but would become the first African American superintendent of a national park. Hattie Carthen, a community activist and environmentalist who was instrumental in leading an urban conservation movement in Brooklyn. And Robert Stanton, who would rise to the highest levels of policymaking as the nation's first African American director of the National Park Service. And African Americans continue to fight to protect communities from environmental degradation. And I'm proud to be part of the team that partners in that fight. As a member of the Natural Resources Committee, we have worked to preserve and protect some of our most sacred spaces. Yesterday, in honor of Black History Month, I introduced the African American Burial Grounds Network Act along with Congresswoman Alma Adams. This legislation would establish a national voluntary network of historic African American cemeteries within the National Park Service. Too often, these historic cemeteries are in dire need of restoration and conservation, and our legislation would provide assistance and financial support for that work. It is critically important that our conservation efforts are inclusive of all Americans' cultural heritage, and that we work to protect historic sites like cemeteries that represent the stories of all Americans. At the same time, we must also ensure that we raise the voices of Black and other minority communities today, because these vulnerable communities are most at risk for the devastating effects of climate change. The National Resources Committee, under the bold and progressive leadership of our chairman, has played a pivotal role in elevating voices of Black communities to ensure the work of Congress is inclusive and reflective of those communities. In fact, our very first full committee hearing on climate change, Reverend Lennox Yearwood Jr., president of the Hip Hop Caucus, testified about the importance of moving away from dirty energy and towards sustainable, renewable energy for all communities, but especially for the health and well-being of minority communities. And just last week, Queen Goodwine of the Gullah Geechee Nation spoke about how the nation's rich contributions to African American history are being threatened by sea level rise along the Atlantic coast. It is refreshing that these vital conservation conversations are taking place on the committee, but they are long overdue. I look forward to more conversations and actions to address these injustices on the committee level in my district and here this afternoon. On that note, thank you again to our panelists for joining us and contributing to the dynamic history of Black History Month. Each of you are truly leaders in the environmental and conservation movements. And just to introduce them for a brief moment, we have Alan Spears. He is the Director of Cultural Resources in the Government Affairs Department of the National Parks Conservation Association. He manages the National Parks Community Partners Program, an initiative designed to connect national parks in Boston, Washington, D.C., Atlanta, Miami, Los Angeles, and San Francisco more closely to racially and ethnically diverse constituents. After joining the Government Affairs Department, Allen introduced and passed the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom Funding Reauthorization Act of 2008. More recently, Allen has co-led or supported 5 successful national monument campaigns, including Fort Monroe, Harriet Tubman, Charles Young, and Pullman. We, of course, also have Mustafa Santiago Ali. He's the Senior Vice President of the Climate, Environmental Justice, and Community Revitalization at the Hip Hop Caucus. Mr. Ali joined the Hip Hop Caucus after working 24 years at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. At the EPA, he served as the Assistant Associate Administrator for Environmental Justice and Senior Advisor for Environmental Justice and Community Revitalization. Mustafa elevated environmental justice issues and worked across federal agencies to strengthen environmental justice policies, programs, and initiatives. At the EPA, Mustafa led the Interagency Work Group on Environmental Justice, which was comprised of 17 federal agencies and White House offices focused on implementing holistic strategies to address the issues facing vulnerable communities. And we have Khalid Shahid. Was that good? All right. Thank you, sir. With the National Resources Defense Council. He is the Senior Project Manager for NRDC's Resilient Communities, Healthy People, and Thriving Communities program, where he focuses on the energy efficiency for all project, which aims to increase utility-funded energy efficiency programs in the affordable multifamily housing sector. He coordinates with NRDC's affordable housing partners to advocate for efficiency investments in the EPA's Clean Power Plan. As part of the LEED Neighborhood Development Incentive, Mr. Shahid also promotes the expansion of green communities in New Orleans. And finally, I want to note that Mr. Gilbert Campbell of Volt Energy was supposed to join us today, but was called away at the last moment based on pressing personal business. Mr. Campbell has done truly remarkable work advancing our transition to a clean energy economy, and we thank him for his leadership as well. We welcome our panelists' remarks today, and with that, we're going to recognize each panelist for 5 minutes, and we'll start off with Mr. Spears.
Congressman McEachin, thank you for hosting this event. It's great to be here today. And also quickly, my thanks to Chris Espinosa, who helped to turn this around on a dime. Thank you both. My name is Alan Spears. I'm the Director of Cultural Resources for the National Parks Conservation Association. NPCA serves as the leading voice of the American people on behalf of their national parks. And this is our centennial anniversary, so we've turned 100 years of conserving and protecting the nation's most important natural, cultural, historic, scenic, and recreational resources. By virtue of the sites they manage and the stories the agency interprets and shares, the National Park Service is one of the largest stewards of African American history and culture in the United States. All the elements of the African American experience from Civil War to civil rights and beyond are captured in the stories and the resources preserved by NPS. As we reflect upon the achievements and struggles and contributions of Black Americans during this Black History Month, we must recognize that national parks, NPS historians and interpretive rangers, and the historic and cultural resource programs they manage are making our history more inclusive, relevant, and compelling. And that in the commemoration of the African American experience lies the key to engaging a more diverse constituency for national parks and public lands. When Carter G. Woodson established the Association for the Study of Negro History, Life and History in 1915, the going consensus was that African Americans had done little to contribute to the growth and development of the United States, and that people of African descent had made no lasting contributions to civilization. These views were held by academics, politicians, and lay people alike, and used to justify everything from segregation to political disenfranchisement to lynching. Yet Woodson and other historians like W.E.B. Du Bois understood that the only way to exclude the African American experience from American history was by ignoring or deliberately overlooking the truth. Now, Woodson wasn't the only person who fought to gain a proper respect and understanding for African American history and culture, but he did develop standards of scholarly research and the vehicles for promoting his findings and those of others who were focused on highlighting Black achievement. Woodson's Journal of Negro History, now the Journal of African American History, was first published in 1916 and remains a leading scholarly publication in the field of African American history. Negro History Week, now Black History Month, was another one of Woodson's concepts for promoting awareness and the pride in African American history, and it's fitting that Dr. Woodson's home was added to the National Park System in 2006. The Park Service, like the nation, was slow to embrace the preservation of African American history and culture, but they began by adding sites like the George Washington Carver National Monument in 1943. More sites followed, including Booker T. Washington National Monument in April of 1956 and the Frederick Douglass Home here in DC in 1962. But it was really through the 1970s and 80s that the number of African American sites grew exponentially in the National Park System. And recently, Presidents Bush and Obama have added to that number of national parks by using the Antiquities Act to establish places like the African Burial Ground in New York, at Fort Monroe, and Birmingham Civil Rights. Currently, 418 of the units that comprise our national park system, of those 418, over 30 are known as African American Experience Sites. And again, that makes the National Park Service one of the largest stewards of African American history in the country. Now, to carry this work more fully forward into the 21st century, NPCA recommends a couple of things. We'd like to see a cultural resource challenge initiated for the National Park Service. We need to make sure that they are making use of best practices and that having historians and archivists and researchers is not considered a luxury but a priority for an agency that has a large national park system, 2/3 of which is historic and cultural by nature. We want full funding for the Historic Preservation Fund. It has never been funded at that $150 million a year authorized funding level. And we want an increase in the budget for the National Heritage Area Program. But for this committee to consider, we also would like to see the 400 Years Commission of African American History be charged with the mission of bringing together superintendents of all the African American experience sites in the National Park System, those 30 and more sites, so that they can actually talk about what that history means and work together to promote it during this anniversary year and beyond. Now, the work of protecting and preserving our history will never be finished, and although there will always be more stories to preserve and interpret, we can and should take a moment during this Black History Month to acknowledge the role the National Park Service plays in ensuring that the African American experience will never again be overlooked or deliberately ignored. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman McEachin, Chairman Grijalva, for having myself and the Hip Hop Caucus here today. If you listen closely, you can hear the ancestors of African slaves reaching out and telling us to keep moving forward, not to give up, that a better time will actually happen. From the times of slaves on our country's shores, on the plantations, brought there not just for their labor, but also for their expertise in agriculture, America has been built upon those backs, those tears, those bloods. And as we've moved forward, we have individuals that we can reference by name who have done incredible work to help to make change happen inside of our country. George Washington Carver, who helped folks to have a better understanding, not just how to utilize peanuts, but also to understand our soils and why it was so important to protect them. You have Matthew Henson, who often is not given the credit in the conservation space for actually helping to lead Perry to the North Pole and to make sure that we understand that he was there first and had to deal with many of the challenges in making direction to that space. But then we can come to a time that is much closer. In 1968, when Dr. King was there marching with the sanitation workers and making the connection between the impacts of jobs and our environment and our public health, and beginning to build the bedrock that would be necessary for us to have a movement that we call the environmental justice movement. You see, the environmental justice movement came into this space because there was not a seat at the table for them. And many of our existing green groups at that time who were focusing on many important things like icebergs and ice shelves and polar bears and things that, yes, we should be focused on, but we also needed to be as equally focused on the impacts that were happening from pollution. And how do we better make sure that voices from vulnerable communities have an opportunity to frame out the direction that we would go in relationship to environmental and climate and conservation. So we have names of individuals that many sometimes don't know. Hazel Johnson, the mother of the environmental justice movement from the south side of Chicago, who coined the term a toxic donut because in her community there in Altgeld Gardens, they were surrounded by 17 polluting facilities. And because of that work that she was able to move forward on addressing the cancer clusters, those having asthma and other bronchial-related diseases, a young man by the name of Barack Obama began his work in community service because of the recommendation of Ms. Hazel Johnson. So we should always remember the power that exists in that space. And then we should call out the name of Dana Alston. Dana Alston helped to pull together the first People of Color Summit in 1991 that brought hundreds and hundreds of individuals from across our country together. And they began to coalesce and say that they had some similar types of impacts that were happening inside of their communities. And out of that first People of Color Summit came the 17 principles of environmental justice. The first one being honoring Mother Earth. Imagine how different our policies would be. Imagine how different how we would direct resources if we truly believed that, and that was a part of the foundation that we stand on. But also out of the environmental justice movement came individuals like Dr. Benjamin Chavis, who coined the term environmental racism because of the things that they were seeing in the South and across our country, where many communities of color were being disproportionately impacted and their health being put in jeopardy. And of course, Dr. Robert Bullard, who founded the Deep South Center along with Dr. Beverly Wright, and then at Clark Atlanta University, Dr. Bullard founded the scientific work that needed to happen in the environmental justice space. But we won't stop there, because we also have to call out the name of Bunyan Bryant, who led the Michigan Working Group. And out of that working group came the recommendations to the Environmental Protection Agency and William Riley at that time to say that we needed to have an Office of Environmental Equity, which became the Office of Environmental Justice at the Environmental Protection Agency. And out of that has come an incredible set of work, everything from the Environmental Justice Small Grants, which provided over $25 million in resources to communities to be able to make change, to the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, to Executive Order 12898 that President Clinton signed in 1994. And we have to call out the name of Dr. Clarice Gaylord, who was the first director of the Office of Environmental Justice, and Miss Vivian Malone Jones, who many will remember because of her civil rights work in integrating college, but also because she was the first regional director of environmental justice in Atlanta. And of course, Harold Mitchell, who's been able to take a $20,000 environmental justice small grant and leverage into over $300 million in changes. And we can't forget our young brothers and sisters like Little Miss Flint and others who are continuing to move forward. Also the Sunrise Movement and This Is 0 Hour. African Americans have made significant contributions and will continue to. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Again, my name is Khalil Shahid, and I'm a senior policy advocate with the Natural Resources Defense Council based here in D.C. with the Healthy People, Thriving Communities program and the Resilient Communities program. The Natural Resources Defense Council is an organization made up of about 1.6 million members, plus many local partners all across the country. We work both here domestically, but also internationally in Latin America, China, as well as in India. And it's really interesting that up here today we have represented someone from the conservation environmental movement, someone from the environmental justice environmental movement. And my organization, although we don't normally frame ourselves in that way, but I think it's self-evident in our name, we could sort of craft ourselves as the natural resources management wing of the environmental movement, even though we are unique as an environmental organization in that we have programs that also deal with nature and wildlife, programs that deal with environmental justice, programs that deal with cities. But I think overarching, our base is really in natural resources management, energy, and energy efficiency. And that's very important because when you think about the African-American contribution and our role in the environmental movement itself is not a singular issue. There is the conservation ethic. And you have people like W.E.B. Du Bois back in 1910, was visiting was visiting the Rocky Mountains and national parks and really writing about what he saw as the sort of dominance of at that moment of the conservation effort. Conservation ethic, and he compared the enclosure of environmental spaces to segregation and warned against sort of overreaching with the conservation ethic at that time. And he wondered aloud whether or not this move by many in the society to widen the space of social inclusion to nature and to the environment would still overlook Black communities. And so he, even at that time, was trying to make Black people visible in the realm of environmental policy and ethics. And then when you go beyond that, when you think about leaders and thinkers such as Huey Newton in 1974 wrote an article, "The Dialectics of Nature," in which he warned about overfishing the ocean. He warned about the overuse of our natural resources. Again, you see the centrality of the civil rights movement and of the move for Black justice in the move for environmentalism. And whereas much of the environmental movement sort of owes its history, say, for example, to the writings of a Rachel Carson, which was a warning against the excesses of industrial society. Black movements in the environmental space always came from the perspective of wanting fairness first in industrial society in the way that it distributes its benefits and burdens, and many of those burdens tend to be issues of air quality, water quality, healthy homes. Those are the issues that we framed as core environmental issues, which were at first neglected by much of the larger environmental movement. And so today, when we think about, the leaders in the space and the people who we owe credit to, I think about people like Shirley Sherrod, who I met when I was on staff with the Federation of Southern Cooperatives in Epps, Alabama, and she was at the office in Macon, Georgia, and you might remember her because she was unfairly treated when she came to work recently, a couple years ago, in the USDA, but people like Shirley Sherrod also represent a livelihood ethic in the environmental movement, because there's been a misnotion that the experience of slavery somehow alienated Black communities from the environment, that we don't want to have anything to do with nature, and that is as far from the truth as possible. In fact, when you go to rural communities, particularly in the Southeast, and particularly these small agricultural communities, and you hear and you see the breadth of ecological knowledge that these farmers have about soil types, about climate, about land rainfall, the ecological knowledge that's stored, within these communities harks back to a time when Harriet Tubman was leading slaves, from slavery to freedom, and the ecological knowledge that she had to have to be able to read the trees, to be able to read the water bodies, to know which way to go, how to get to safety. So we have this history, this storehouse of ecological knowledge in our communities. And really, the last thing I'll say, it really starts with each individual in our families. My father took me fishing every chance he could get, and he taught me, how to be in nature, how to be a part of nature. I'm from a community from South Louisiana. Many of us work in the oil and gas industry. We harvest the earth. We don't want to spoil our land, and so when we address issues of climate change, we have to be, one, diligent about making sure that we have a just transition for those communities and for those families that have made their livelihood for themselves and their families for generations, off of this resource, and how can we transition them to something that is going to provide them livelihoods of dignity. And so, the importance and the centrality of Black movements, of Black thoughts, not only to environmentalism, but also to the body politic and the politics of this country writ large. And I'll stop there. Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. McEachin, for chairing this meeting and for your leadership on a variety of issues that have been talked about by the panelists. And I particularly want to highlight part of your comments and testimony, Mr. Spears, you're absolutely right. I think the emphasis, at least within the jurisdiction of this committee, is historical preservation, heritage areas, cultural resources, being part and parcel of telling the story of America. And it's not only the funding issues, I think sometimes it's the emphasis issue, that's an important component. With Mr. McEachin's able leadership, moving in the direction that you were recommending, not only on the funding side, but on the emphasis side. Because as we celebrate Black History Month, it's important, as it was stated, to point to those uplifting, soaring moments that made this country indeed better as a consequence of the contributions of Black Americans to this nation of ours. It is also important for the story of America to tell the whole story. And that involves those periods, those darker periods of this nation, periods of slavery, and the vestiges of racism that we continue to confront. That helps our nation understand, and it helps us deal with this issue that all too often is not dealt with well. And I think the Park Services and Interior in general can play a big role in the telling of that full story, and I appreciate your comments very much. You know, we were at a meeting the other day, and Mr. McEachin and I were here at our first meeting, organizing meeting for the Resources Committee. And being my first time as chairman, I was kind of stumbling along, see what the heck was going to happen. And then we got into this very back and forth, long discussion about God, country, and what that means, you know? And we went back and forth, and everybody having an opportunity to proclaim their fidelity to those things, right? And toward the end, Mr. McEachin said something very profound and very powerful. And it spoke to the point about being a diverse nation as we are, we can't cookie cutter our history to fit a certain mold. There's a multitude of things that have happened. And I thought when he ended his statement, it was very, very good and kind of closed the discussion. And then we also heard about this committee should not be talking about climate change. We should be talking about what this committee has done, and that was brought up by the former majority. We did these trails, we did these things for civil rights, and therefore, why don't we talk about that? The small failure to point out that every one of these major pieces of legislation that have acknowledged that percentage that you mentioned, Spears, has been the product and the authorship and the work of African-American members of Congress that have promoted much of that legislation. And we need to do more. I put that in that frame and in that context because as we go forward and we strive to be more inclusive and look at environmental questions from conservation to preservation and everything in between, do it in a different table as the other panelists pointed out so aptly. Do it at a table where everybody's there. Do it at a table where it's the full story. And there's no unintended consequences to a community because they were left out of the discussion. And so, Mr. McEachin, thank you very much. And we're going to look forward to working with you to address, I think, some of the recommendations and observations that our able panelists have brought up today. And it's a wonderful time to celebrate, and at the same time to reaffirm that we're not there yet and there's some work to do. Thank you, Mr. McEachin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Case, any comments you might care to make?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and to the panelists, thank you very much for your presentations. I wanted to come today to listen to you and for a couple of other reasons. Number one, of course, is to provide my own recognition of Black History Month and the rich contributions of African Americans to our country I think number two, I wanted to support our acting chair and our chair's very specific recognition of the special role of African Americans in our conservation movement. In all honesty, I had not fully focused on it, and perhaps that's a story to be told on a more amplified level, because I think most Americans probably are not familiar with all of those rich and varied contributions. And I think the third reason that I wanted to come was to add some small support to the concept that when we talk about natural resources, when we talk about the jurisdiction of this committee, when we talk about the National Park Service, we're not just talking about natural resources, but cultural resources. And I think that one thing that I focus on in this hearing, listening to you, is that when I go to a national park, when I go to a national monument, when I go to a national historic site, I am feeling the combination of the place and the event. I'm trying to put it all together to absorb what it was like to the folks that participated there at the time. And so this incredible, and I think very, very welcome focus by the National Park Service and our other natural resource community on not just the preservation of our natural resources, but our cultural resources is exactly the right way to go. You know, I come from a state that has its own African American history, a very interesting one. And it's to the chair's point that you can't always apply a cookie cutter approach throughout the country. In Hawaii, where I'm from, of course, we have one of the most ethnically diverse communities in our country, with a deep history with African Americans as well. Started coming to Hawaii in the late 1700s and into the 1800s, and it was an independent country at the time. So some of the concepts that were so rife on the mainland, as we call it, didn't exist in Hawaii. African Americans came to Hawaii. They settled there. They were citizens there. They were treated pretty much like anybody else. It was only later that some of the, frankly, the discrimination, like anywhere else in our country, came. And we have dealt with that in our own way. And what's interesting to me also is that, you know, we talk about how we can find little bits and pieces of African American history throughout our country in kind of unique ways. One item in Hawaii that really has just come to light recently is a very interesting part of our history, forgotten part of our history of African American service members in the Second World War. They served in Hawaii. They did their part in that war like anybody else. They lived in segregated barracks in and around Pearl Harbor, and one of those barracks is called Manana Barracks, and there is an effort right now by the African American community in Hawaii to find some special recognition of the role of African Americans in the Pacific War and in Hawaii and specifically, and to recognize the fact that they lived in segregated barracks. And you know, it's reported that many of the folks that served in those barracks went on, for example, to prominent careers in the Negro Leagues because they could not go to the major leagues in those era, even though Joe DiMaggio also served in the military in Hawaii during the war, and of course he went on to the major leagues. Reportedly, John Coltrane was in these barracks as well and played at clubs throughout Honolulu during the war. So that's a little speck of African American history in an unusual time and place. And I think we can celebrate those things in our not only in our celebration of our ethnic histories, but also in our national parks and our national cultural heritage. So I think we all are on the same page. I think we're all trying to celebrate it wherever it comes and however it comes, and I'm happy to be a part of it. And just a quick question to Mr. Spears along those lines. You mentioned you had 3 priorities, and I just focus on one of them, and I just wanted to make sure I got it correct. You said support cultural reserve challenges. Is that what you said? What
yes,
is
sir.
that?
Cultural Resource Challenge for the National
sorry.
Park Service.
Okay.
Yes.
And what exactly is that? Is that about finding those areas, those special areas, and preserving them?
It's about providing the Park Service with the financial resources to really concentrate on upping their game when it comes to cultural resource management. What we see is, I'm a historian by training. You would never send me to Rocky Mountain National Park to take care of elk. It just wouldn't happen. But far too often what happens with the Park Service is that history and historic preservation and cultural resource management get bumped to being collateral duties. It is regarded as sometimes as a luxury during cycles of tight budgets for parks to have historians and archivists. Parks get behind in their paperwork. Sometimes they can't tell you what's in their acquisition collection, and that has a knock-on effect of reducing the effectiveness of the parks, the Park Service being able to tell the public what they have, to display what they have, to talk about it, to interpret it. And we want a professional workforce for the National Park Service. We want them well-trained, well-educated. We want them leading, as they so often do, and we want them using best practices.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Now, this conversation can go in any direction that you all care to take it. I'm just going to throw out this question, and if it leads to other comments and questions, so be it. But I'm curious, as an African American, are there specific barriers or obstacles that you've faced in your career as an environmental professional? What changes do we need to make, either administratively, within the government, or through actual legislation to help other people of color follow the trail that you all have blazed? And all three of you could answer, I mean, in whatever order you want to.
Oh, yes, I'm sure all three of us can answer that question. Yes, sir. Barriers, I think barriers to work in the environmental field for any person of color, I think first has to be with perception. And I think this actually gets into, the question of historic preservation and how our natural spaces are, how we document them, but also how they are presented to us. And the environment, whether it be, where we live, work, and play in our cities, if you look at the distribution of green spaces and parks within any given city, communities of color rarely have access to functional, high-quality, green spaces and park services. When you think about national parks, the film last year, there is the perception or the fear that national park spaces, that camping, that these spaces are going to be hostile spaces to African Americans. And so that engagement, with nature in that sense, may not always be there the way that we want. But I think that also shapes how we also engage with the field from a professional and an academic perspective. And so the environmental field is not one that we necessarily gravitate towards when we enter into college, because we don't see ourselves represented in that field professionally. But then also for professional organizations, whether it be federal organizations or nonprofits like mine, when we look at staffing requirements, maybe the degree from the environmental law school, isn't, the only set of skills that can be useful to the work that we have before us, to making the policy that we have before us, to advocating for, communities, in the way that we need. And so maybe we need to also broaden what we think of as environmental related skills to bring people into these positions. And also, I think, also rethinking what we think of as environmental policy. Many people, when we talk about climate change and climate policy, many people reduce climate change and climate policy to regulating carbon emissions. But there are many other facets to climate policy that also deals with helping communities transition, workforce development, healthcare, and climate. So there are many other facets and many ways people can engage in environmental policy advocacy, environmental policy making, that don't necessarily have to come from an environmental science background. And so I think for us, it's really about broadening what we think of, again, as the environment, which the environmental justice movement has been teaching us, since its inception. But we still haven't really incorporated that lesson very well.
How much time do you have? So we have a number of opportunities that are in front of us. One, we should be better funding our minority serving institutions, our historically black colleges, our tribal colleges, our colleges and universities that have larger Latino populations. Because when we don't do that, it makes it much more difficult for our STEM programs to find a feeder system, if you will, So I think that that is extremely important. We don't have to look any further than Bennett College, which recently had a number of financial challenges, and that's because of the way that the resources flow to our educational institutions. Structurally, environmental justice has always been an intersection point for many communities of color to get traction, to get conversations started in many of our federal agencies, the 17 agencies that you mentioned earlier. So if we look, when I was in the federal government, I was the only senior advisor for environmental justice for the entire government. And I had responsibility for trying to navigate with a number of other secretaries and administrators. So we've got to change that dynamic. So we should be having conversations about how do we get senior level individuals and all of those other agencies and departments who will then be a part of the conversations around policy and budgets. Because if they're not there, then in many instances there will be a trickle-down effect at best. We need to start to have serious conversations with our green groups and foundations. We know that recently the Green 2.0 report that came out that said we're actually moving backwards in relationship to those at the senior levels, which there are very few, if any, at many of those institutions. We also know that there's retention problems that are existing in all of those. And we also know that just getting people in the door has also seemed to be a challenge. So if we are going to address the issues of climate change and conservation, then we need to make sure that those voices are there in leadership positions and also to help to guide the priority setting in each of those. We also need to, in the federal government, to support leadership programs. So there's the SES program, but we need to make sure that there are other programs that help to get folks of color into the door and then up the ranks so that they can also be able to help us to move forward on moving in a more positive direction. The appropriations process, not necessarily the privy of this committee, but we should be making sure that in the approps process that none of the money that's going through is going to be damaging communities that are already dealing with a disproportionate burden. And as someone who worked on Capitol Hill for 2 years, I understand that process fairly intimately. And then finally, it's time for environmental justice legislation. Now, we've had a couple of bills that have been over the years. The first one was with John Lewis in 1992, and as recently with Cory Booker and others. So we need to make sure that we stop just talking about making sure that we're going to have these pieces that are necessary for folks to be better protected and also to help them to move forward. And then, of course, the diversity aspect also is in that space as well. We need to make sure that we are going out with our committees, with our staffing positions, and finding folks who come from these sets of experiences so that they can help to contribute to the great work that is currently being moved forward on here on Capitol Hill. I'll stop there because I have about 24 more pages for that one.
The discussion about legislation, Mr. McEachin has a piece of legislation. We in the past have introduced pieces of legislation. An ongoing discussion right now with committee staff, with stakeholders in environmental justice, talk about what this looks like. But at the end of the day, your point about codifying this into law is essential, because even the executive orders were somewhat discretionary given attitude or priorities of a given agency. This is codified into law, then everybody's obligated or mandated, right? Okay.
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I agree with the policy recommendations and observations of my colleagues, but want to take this in a slightly different direction. The last 3 years I spent working for the National Parks Conservation Association. I have met with people who survived the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in 1963. I have met with veterans who walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in 1965. I have met with people who organized for the United Farm Workers in California in the 1960s. So I have no barriers or challenges compared to the folks that have gone before, and I stand solidly on their shoulders, and I want to help fight to make sure that the people who did face barriers and challenges get the due recognition that they deserve.
Been joined by our colleague from Nevada, Mr. Horsford. Any comments you care to make?
Thank you, Congressman. First, let me thank you, Congressman McEachin, as well as the chairman, Mr. Grijalva, for taking the time to host today's forum honoring African American leaders of cultural heritage and environmental justice. A lot of times in this committee, I don't think we do enough to recognize the many communities that contribute to our nation. And I think it's very important that we recognize that today as part of Black History Month, which is an important opportunity to recognize and to remember what our fellow brothers and sisters have done to promote civil rights in America. When discussing Black leaders, we often overlook the many contributions that the African American community has made to promote environmental justice and science. So today I want to honor a man who has made untold contributions to environmental science and has served as a great role model for young African Americans who want to pursue a career in science and research. Today I honor Dr. Warren Washington, an American atmospheric scientist who has made unparalleled contributions to climate science. Dr. Washington was born in Portland, Oregon. He graduated from Oregon State University with a Bachelor of Science in Physics and a Master of Science in Meteorology, and later became the second African American to obtain a doctoral degree in meteorology.
Don't ask me, husband. I'd be lost for
from Pennsylvania State University back in 1964. Dr. Washington is an internationally recognized expert in atmospheric sciences and climate research. He specializes in computer modeling of the Earth's climate and collaborated to create the earliest computer climate models. These climate models have changed the way scientists view the world and understand climate change, an issue that I know the chairman is very committed to having this committee address this Congress. Throughout his tenure, Dr. Washington advised 6 presidents: President Jimmy Carter, President Ronald Reagan, President George H.W. Bush, President Bill Clinton, President George W. Bush, and President Barack Obama about climate change. Over the years, Dr. Washington has published almost 200 papers in professional scientific journals and garnered dozens of national and international awards. Dr. Washington's research was used extensively in the 2007 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Assessment, for which Dr. Washington, along with many colleagues around the world, shared the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. He is currently a senior scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado, where he uses the Community Earth System model to study the Earth's past, present, and future climate states to better understand the impacts of climate change in the 21st century. So I'm very honored to join with you, Congressman McEachin, and our chairman. Perhaps we can invite Dr. Washington to be part of one of our future panels on climate change, since he's such a phenomenal expert. And I commend the panelists today. Thank you for bringing your recommendations, your voice, and your perspective to these very important issues around environmental justice. We cannot have justice that does not include racial justice for all communities, particularly those who have been harmed based on the policies that have been set and the institutional racism that does exist, continues to exist, unfortunately, in many of our organizations and in our policies. So thank you very much, Congressman. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, Congressman. We have about 7 minutes left, and this next question is a little bit unfair because it's loaded. If it takes us past the 7 minutes, so be it, but just try to bear that in mind. You know, amazingly, as the chairman spoke about at one of our first meetings, we actually had a person come in and say that the movement to clean energy and to a green economy was not good for communities of color. And it harkened me back to when I first got elected to Congress. The Koch brothers actually came by happenstance, I'm sure, into my district, got with a bunch of pastors and had a forum on how fossil fuels and the fossil fuel economy what was best for communities of color. But as we've seen both from y'all's testimony and other testimonies that we've seen elsewhere, there are African Americans and other people of color actively invested in trying to move us to a green collar economy. What does their work say about the costs and benefits of environmental protections and about the urgency, if I can borrow a phrase from Martin Luther King Jr., the fierce urgency of now of our fight against pollution and climate change? And I open that up to any of you.
Well, I'm glad I wasn't there when the gentleman said that, because the reality of the situation is that I'm now getting close to worked in over 1,000 communities across our country and a few outside of our country. In each of those instances, I have never yet seen a fossil fuel facility be located in a community and the value of anyone's homes to go up. So therefore, if that is one of the ways that we pass on generational wealth, then it seems that that would not be something that you would want to do if you actually wanted folks to be in a better position. The reality of the situation is that we have 200,000 people in our country who are dying prematurely from air pollution. We have 25 million folks who have asthma, 7 million children, and disproportionately as African American and Latino children who are the ones who are going to the emergency room. One of the ways that we can address that is by making sure that we're moving toward renewables, because wind and solar, of course, will not produce that pollution and therefore will lower some of the impacts that are happening inside of those communities. And the reason, Congressman, that is so important is that in our country, right now we have 40 million people who are living in poverty. We have a huge amount of folks who are underinsured and uninsured still. I believe it's around 20 million folks. So when we're putting these overlays on folks, we are taking away their health and their wealth. And we know that we are now creating more jobs in the solar space, in the wind space, and of course are in the fossil fuel industry. And we know that we have an extremely bright future. And that's why when folks are talking about a Green New Deal as a framework for the future, it finally allows people to have equity in that process. It allows us to move forward in a way that we no longer have to depend on an extractive economy to provide some basic abilities for folks to make money. It gives them choices and opportunities. And all the times that I've spoken with people across this country, if you give them an opportunity to have a clean, green job over one that will impact not only their health, but their children's health, they're going to choose the first.
Yes, sir. That is a big question, but it only in a sense that the response to it needs to be so overwhelmingly, against the notion that transitioning to a green economy is somehow harmful to communities of color and African Americans particularly, because the issue of race inequality is part and parcel with our environmental and climate crisis. When you think about, our car-dependent lifestyles, which drive a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, part of that was built into the fabric of this nation, which drove a lot of wealth inequality through FHA loans, which subsidized the build-out of the suburbs, which made it possible for certain cities to pull up their public transit infrastructure, to push people more into private cars, which led us to this disparity in wealth in terms of property and income for communities of color. You also talk about, the way that our agricultural system benefits large industrial-sized agriculture, which contributes a very large proportion of our aggregate carbon emissions, which disadvantages small farmers, particularly black farmers in the Southeast, like those who I worked with when I was with the Federation of Southern Cooperatives. We prioritized certain investments in agriculture that created a very unsustainable agricultural system, which force feeds us agricultural products and not whole foods. And I'm not giving, that's not free advertisement to the store. but, which leads also to disparities in health outcomes, diabetes, et cetera. And then you're also talking about, again, the build out of our cities and what was left in the wake of a lot of disinvestment in communities of color, lower air quality, toxic substances, both in our soils, lead paint, lead in our homes, lead in our water, leading to an overabundance of respiratory illnesses and other psychosocial effects of lead poisoning in our children. And so there is just no justification. There's no way. And then you're also talking about the overburden that communities of color, families of color face in paying higher and higher utility costs. And so each time a coal-fired power plant wants to build a new plant to meet rising energy demand, anytime they want to install some new technology, scrubbers, carbon capture, whatever it is, they pass those costs on to consumers, costs that could be better invested into local renewable capacity. And you're seeing increasingly, families are having to make very difficult choices between paying utility bills, buying medicine, buying school supplies, or even eating. And we're also starting to see a very strong correlation between evictions of poor families and energy costs in the home. Because we see it on a cycle, whether in the dead heat of summer or in the dead cold of winter, people are forced to forego paying rent in order to pay utilities, or vice versa. And so there's a direct correlation between evictions in some of our largest cities and rising energy costs for families who are least capable of being able to afford it. And so on no uncertain terms, that type of logic is both faulty and just needs to be met with a vigorous rebuttal.
I think my colleagues covered it. Thank you.
Yes, if I could just have 30 seconds. So I find that when people sort of share that type of foolishness, and I'm using my grandmother's word with that, is that it's better to just ground it in the reality of what's really going on the ground and to share those examples. And there are numerous ones of how folks are changing that paradigm. So in Spartanburg, South Carolina, I'll use just one part of the overall success that they've had, but they had shotgun housing. So for those of us who are from the South, we know what shotgun housing is. In the sense you open the front door, you can see out the back door, not a whole lot of energy efficiency in that space. Folks in South Carolina and there in Spartanburg were paying $300 to $400 a month for their electricity costs. We got 500 new green homes into that community, energy efficient, radiant barriers. They got the cost down to $67 a month. And we're now about to put a 35-acre solar farm on cleaned up brownfield and Superfund sites, which will zero out people's electricity costs. So I would pose that as an example to the gentleman that you mentioned and say, how is that raising people's electricity costs or costing them more money? Not only is it lowering their costs, but it's also bringing hope, and it's also giving folks an opportunity to pass on generational wealth. So if they have a better example, I'd love to hear it.
Well, thank you. Thank you all. As we conclude, again, I want to thank our chairman for convening this panel, my colleagues for participating in it, and just to remind us all of the challenge that we face. As we try to expand the environmental movement, it started off, and forgive my pejorative view, but it started off with landowners who were worried about view sheds. It then became more impactful with folks being concerned about 2050. And quite frankly, I'll be 89 years old in 2050, so I'll consider that a bonus year. I think the challenge is that most voters, today's voters at least, don't think in terms of 2050, they think in terms of now. And one of the things that we have to do a better job of as the environmental movement, as activists, as legislators, is to impress upon people why now. There are costs being incurred now. There's disease being suffered through now. And if we can get that going, if we can convince people, again, to use Dr. King's words, the fierce urgency of now, we'll be able to elevate this conversation to the kitchen table. And once we get it at the kitchen table, it will take care of itself. So I thank all of you for being here and challenge you to help us with our continuing cause to clean up God's earth. Thank you.